How did women survive their periods in a world with no pads, no tampons, and not even reliable underwear? This is one of the most deliberately hidden chapters in human history. And I mean that literally. Most of the evidence was never written down, because almost every historian, physician, and lawmaker who could have recorded it was a man who didn't think it was worth mentioning. What actually survived? Buried in ancient medical scrolls, forgotten trash pits, and oral tradition passed in whispers between women is stranger, darker, and more impressive than anything you learned in school. I'm going to bust one of the biggest myths about this topic that's been spreading online for years, completely unchallenged. And near the end, I'm going to tell you about a corporate scandal from the 1980s that got buried so effectively. Most people alive today have never heard of it. Even though it killed people. Stick around, because the full picture is not what you think. Let's start with why this history is so hard to find in the first place. Cloth disintegrates when it's washed enough times. Moss and plant fiber rot back into the earth. And the few written records that survived were made almost exclusively by men, who barely acknowledged women's bodies existed as a subject worth documenting. So the real history here isn't one clean story. It's a puzzle pieced together from fragments that historians are still actively fighting over. Go back to ancient Egypt, around 1550 BC, and you find one of the most medically advanced societies of the ancient world. Egyptian physicians wrote detailed gynecological texts. Documents like the Kahun papyrus prove they were studying women's health with real scientific seriousness thousands of years before anyone else attempted it. You'll see plenty of claims online that Egyptian women invented the first tampon using softened papyrus. It's a great story, and it gets repeated constantly, but here's the uncensored truth. Historians say the direct evidence for that specific claim is thin. What we do have is something arguably more revealing. Surviving workforce logs from Deir el-Medina, the village of the artisans who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Buried in those ancient attendance records are entries about workers missing shifts tied to the menstruation of their wives or daughters. Historians still argue over exactly what that meant, but it proves something wild. This wasn't a hidden shame in Egyptian society. It was acknowledged openly in official government-adjacent records thousands of years before most modern workplaces would even say the word out loud. Then civilization shifts to Greece and Rome, and the story turns genuinely disturbing. Male physicians decided the male body was the default setting for a human being, and the female body was just a colder, wetter malfunction of it. Hippocratic doctors believed women's flesh literally retained more fluid, and that a period was just the body dumping the excess. And then there's the theory that sounds like it belongs in a horror movie, The Wandering Womb. Ancient Greek physicians genuinely believed the uterus could detach and roam around inside a woman's body if it went too long without pregnancy, crushing organs, causing suffocation, causing what they labeled hysteria for managing the actual bleeding. Historians believe women likely used wool, folded cloth, or sea sponges pulled from the Mediterranean. But here's the disturbing part. Roman society considered women's hygiene so unimportant that almost nobody bothered writing it down in real detail. What they did write down, endlessly, was superstition. The Roman scholar Pliny the Elder claimed a menstruating woman could too sour wine, kill crops, rust iron, and drive dogs mad just by walking past. A completely natural biological process got rewritten into something close to a curse, and that reframing echoed for centuries after Rome fell. Now let's go somewhere most versions of this story skip entirely. Ancient China. Traditional Chinese medicine treated menstrual blood through the lens of qi and blood flow. Irregular or painful periods, that were seen as a sign of imbalance to be corrected through herbal medicine, not shame. But social taboos still ran deep. In many periods of Chinese history, menstruating women were restricted from religious ceremonies, ancestral worship, and temple visits based on ideas about ritual purity that persisted for centuries. For material, cloth strips, sometimes ash-lined for extra absorption, were washed and reused, a practice that in some rural regions persisted well into the 20th century, right up until commercial products became affordable and widely available. Ancient India tells a similarly split story, sacred in some contexts, restrictive in others. In Hindu tradition, menstruating women were historically excluded from temple entry, kitchen spaces, and religious rituals, based on concepts of ritual impurity found in some religious texts. But this wasn't universal or simple. Some traditions simultaneously linked menstruation to fertility and creative power, treating it as connected to the divine feminine rather than something purely shameful. Meanwhile, in Jewish tradition, the laws of niddah, dating back to the Torah, established a defined period of separation during menstruation, followed by ritual immersion in a mikveh, a structured religious system, still observed by some communities today, that governed intimacy and ritual purity around the menstrual cycle for thousands of years. If we look at early cultures across the Americas, the story is not a monolith either. It swings from deeply sacred to deeply restrictive depending on which nation you're looking at. Among the Deir, or Navajo people, a girl's first period isn't hidden. It's celebrated with the Kinaaldá, a multi-day ceremony tied to one of their most revered deities, Changing Woman. She runs toward the rising sun to build endurance, helps bake a massive ceremonial corn cake, and is physically and spiritually prepared by the women of her community for a life of strength. In other indigenous communities across the continent, menstrual seclusion created dedicated space and time for rest and ceremony. Historians are careful to say this complex tradition can't be flattened into either purely empowering or purely restrictive. It was both, depending on the culture and the era, and reducing it to one simple narrative erases the real complexity of these traditions. Now let's get to the myth, the one you've probably seen repeated 100 times online without anyone actually checking it. The claim is that medieval European women simply bled directly into their clothes while working in the fields, with no protection at all, because they supposedly wore no undergarments. It's repeated constantly, treated as an established fact, and new archaeological evidence says it's likely wrong. Researchers digging through textile fragments recovered from actual medieval latrines and waste pits found something the myth completely erased. Evidence of folded fabric pads, fastening bands, and chemises that were deliberately tucked and pinned to hold protection in place. Some women also used sphagnum moss, bog moss, which can absorb many times its own weight in liquid and has natural properties that slow bacterial growth. This wasn't to primitive helplessness. It was functional, resourceful engineering hidden from the historical record simply because nobody in power thought a peasant woman's daily life was worth writing down. Fast forward to the Victorian era, and the secrecy becomes almost extreme. This was a culture obsessed with modesty, yet women had almost no real commercial products, just reusable cloth, which had to be washed, boiled, and dried completely out of sight. Imagine holding hot water by hand just to secretly clean bloodied fabric before anyone in your household noticed. The stigma ran so deep that even mentioning a period to a doctor was considered improper. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, women had moved to thick, reusable pads held in place by menstrual belts. Bulky, harness-like contraptions with dangling clips front and back, uncomfortable, constantly needing adjustment, but still miles better than nothing. And then, the turning point nobody expects, because it comes directly out of a war. During World War I, a company called Kimberly-Clark developed a material called cotton, wood pulp, 5 times more absorbent than cotton, mass-produced to treat soldiers' gunshot wounds on the battlefield. Nurses in those field hospitals quietly figured out that the surgical bandages worked far better for their own periods than anything else available. So they started using them off-label, out of pure necessity. Kimberly-Clark noticed the pattern and pivoted an entire wartime product into a consumer brand. Kotex launched around 1920, but even then, the shame hadn't disappeared. Early Kotex sales relied on a silent purchase system. The woman could drop a coin into a box at the pharmacy and take an unmarked package off the counter without ever having to say the word, the menstruation, out loud to a male clerk. Now here's the part of this history that genuinely gets buried, even in most documentaries covering this topic. In 1980, a tampon brand called Rely, made by Procter & Gamble, hit the market using a new super-absorbent synthetic material that could be worn far longer than traditional cotton tampons. It was marketed as a breakthrough. What almost nobody knew was that the material created the perfect breeding ground for a specific, dangerous bacteria, and within months, hundreds of women, some of them teenagers, developed a life-threatening illness called toxic shock syndrome. Dozens of women died. The scandal forced the CDC into one of its most urgent investigations of the decade, and Rely was pulled from shelves entirely. It remains one of the most significant and most quietly forgotten public health scandals in modern consumer product history. A reminder that even in the modern, supposedly solved era of period products, women's safety was treated as a secondary concern until people started dying. Even today, remnants of that ancient stigma haven't fully disappeared. Right up until surprisingly recently, many countries taxed period products as luxury or non-essential items, the so-called tampon tax, while treating things like razors or chapstick as necessities. Some regions still impose this today, and campaigns to eliminate it have made headlines worldwide, precisely because the underlying attitude that a woman's biology is something separate from her health needs traces in a direct, unbroken line back to Pliny the Elder, claiming a menstruating woman could curse a crop field. So here's the real uncensored takeaway. This isn't a clean story of primitive suffering slowly fixed by modern convenience. It's a history that was actively hidden, some of it erased by decomposition, some of it erased because men in power simply didn't record it, some of it deliberately buried under religious law and social shame, and some of it, disturbingly, buried by a corporation after people died. Egyptian workers got time off for it, openly recorded. Roman scholars claimed it could curse crops. Navajo communities built sacred ceremony around it. Jewish law structured entire religious practices around it. Medieval women engineered real solutions that a popular myth still gets completely wrong today. And a 1980 tampon scandal killed women and barely stays in the cultural memory at all. If this uncovered something you never learned in school, subscribe, because next time I'm covering the equally hidden, equally wild history of childbirth practices across the ancient world. And it goes even further than this one.